The first time I realized my new neighbors had crossed onto my land, I was standing in wet grass with mud on my boots and a shovel over my shoulder, and for a second I honestly thought I had to be looking at it wrong. There were trenches cut clean through the eastern meadow, gravel spread in long bright strips, thick black perforated pipe laid out in rows like ribs under the dirt, and I just stood there staring because none of it made any sense. Then it hit me all at once. They hadn't wandered over by mistake. They hadn't clipped a fence post or bumped a tractor tire across the line. They had built a septic drain field 80 feet inside my property and somehow expected nobody would notice. I live outside Middlebury, Vermont, on 27 acres I bought back in 2011, an old farmhouse tucked against a stretch of meadow and hardwood trees with a narrow creek running behind the orchard. It's quiet out there, the kind of quiet where mornings feel slow and clean, and the loudest thing you hear most days is wind pushing through maples or a tractor 2 fields over. I spent years rebuilding that place. The farmhouse needed work top to bottom. The barn roof leaked. Half the fencing had collapsed. But I loved every inch of it. I built it into the kind of place I planned to grow old in. By 2018, I'd finally gotten serious about expanding into certified organic produce. I wasn't dabbling. I'd spent years on soil testing, crop rotation planning, inspections, paperwork, all of it. The eastern meadow mattered more than almost anything because the drainage was perfect and the soil there tested beautifully. That section was going to be my spring planting field. The boundary on that side had always been obvious. There was an old stone wall laid by hand probably 150 years ago, then iron survey pins driven deep where the ridge flattened out. Nobody ever questioned it. The old owner next door, a retired dairy farmer named Ben Callahan, used to joke that the stone wall had survived 3 generations and 2 divorces, so it had probably outlived both of us. Ben sold the farm a year later to a couple from Massachusetts named Mark and Claire Whitaker. Nice enough at first. Money from Boston. Tech consulting, I think. They wanted the Vermont farmhouse dream. Fresh eggs, scenic views, a restored red barn, that whole thing. I welcomed them with homemade apple butter and a loaf of bread because that's what folks do around there. Claire hugged me like we were already friends. Mark shook my hand and told me they couldn't wait to settle in. For the first couple months, everything seemed normal. Contractors came in and out. Delivery trucks. Renovation crews. They redid the house, tore out fencing, landscaped the driveway. Loud but manageable. Then sometime in early June, I noticed excavation equipment near the ridge. A mini excavator. A dump truck. A crew digging deep trenches. I figured maybe they were replacing drainage. Their side had a rocky slope and standing water every spring. Didn't think much about it until 2 days later when I walked the line carrying fence tools and saw fresh tire tracks crossing the stone wall. That stopped me cold. I followed the tracks through knee-high grass and then saw the trenches. Perfectly cut. Gravel already poured. Pipe laid in place. It was unmistakable. Septic field. On my land. I checked the nearest iron pin. Then another. Then the wall. No question. They were deep over the line. I took pictures. GPS coordinates. Video. Every angle I could think of. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Not angry yet. Not fully. More disbelief than anything. Like surely this had to be some absurd contractor mistake that would get fixed with one awkward conversation. So I walked straight to their house. Mark was on the front porch with a clipboard and a contractor wearing sunglasses. Claire was carrying paint samples. Mark smiled when he saw me and said, "Hey Ethan, timing's good, we finally got the exterior color picked." I didn't smile back. I said, "You've got a septic drain field installed on my property." That landed like a brick. Claire lowered the paint samples. Mark blinked. The contractor shifted his feet. Mark let out a quick nervous laugh and said, No, that can't be right." "It is," I told him. "You crossed the wall and ran pipe 80 feet into my meadow." The contractor spoke up first. "We followed the survey stakes." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Then your stakes are wrong." Mark grabbed his phone and stepped off the porch. I could hear him talking fast, voice dropping lower every second. When he came back, he didn't look confused anymore. He looked tense. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Okay, worst case here. Maybe we're a little over. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. I can compensate you." I just stared at him. "Compensate me? Sure. Easement. Fair market. Whatever number makes sense." And that was the exact moment my disbelief turned into anger because that meadow wasn't spare land. It wasn't empty space he could buy his way into. It was years of planning and thousands of dollars, and everything I'd worked toward. I stepped closer and said quietly, "Mark, remove every inch of it." He looked annoyed now. Defensive. "You're really serious?" "Dead serious." Claire finally spoke, trying to smooth things over. "Ethan, I'm sure there's a compromise." I shook my head. "No compromise. Take it out, or I handle it another way." Then I turned and walked back across the field while the three of them stood on the porch watching me leave, and halfway back to the barn I already knew exactly who I was calling next. By the time I reached the barn, I already had my phone out. There are moments when your gut tells you whether something's headed toward a quick fix or a full-blown mess, and mine was screaming that this one was going to get ugly. I called my attorney, Rachel Mercer. Rachel lived 20 minutes away in Brandon and handled real estate and agricultural property disputes all over Addison County. Sharp as a razor, dry sense of humor, and the kind of person who could read 3 inches of legal filings while drinking coffee and somehow still catch details nobody else saw. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Rachel, my neighbors installed a septic field on my property." There was a pause. Then she said, calm as ever, "That's a new one. I'm heading over." She pulled in less than an hour later wearing jeans, boots, and carrying a legal pad. We walked the line together. She checked the stone wall, found both survey pins, took photos, asked me where the pipe entered, followed the trench herself. Then she crouched beside the gravel bed for a few seconds without saying anything. Finally, she stood up and looked at me. "This is bad for them." "How bad?" "Trespass, for starters. Potential environmental contamination if your certification process gets impacted. Depending on permitting, maybe more." Then she glanced toward the Whitakers' house and added, "And they absolutely know they crossed now." We spent the next 2 hours documenting everything. Rachel liked details, distances, timestamps, property records, photos from multiple angles. She asked if I'd had previous surveys. I handed her the originals from the farmhouse office. She smiled and said, "Perfect." Before sunset, she had paperwork moving for an emergency injunction. The hearing was set fast, 3 business days later. Mark didn't come by. Claire didn't text. Nobody apologized, which honestly surprised me. I figured at least one of them would try smoothing things over. Instead, they doubled down. Construction continued like nothing happened. The excavator stayed parked near the trench. Workers kept coming and going. Like if they ignored reality long enough, maybe it would become legal. The hearing took place at the county courthouse on a rainy Thursday morning. Small courtroom, wood benches, smelled faintly like old paper and coffee. Mark and Claire were already there with their attorney and a surveyor I hadn't met before. Mark gave me a tight nod. Claire wouldn't look at me. Their lawyer started with the same argument I expected. Licensed surveyor. Honest mistake. Reliance on professional markings. No malicious intent. Rachel let him finish. Then she walked the judge through the photographs, the deed, the certified survey records, the iron pins, the stone wall, and finally the GPS data. Clean. Simple. No theatrics. The judge was an older man named Harold Baines. Quiet voice. Didn't interrupt much. But when the Whitakers' lawyer tried arguing that the septic installation was already underway and removal would create undue hardship, Judge Baines leaned forward and said, "Hardship caused by building on someone else's land remains your hardship." Nobody said much after that. The ruling came fast. The Whitakers were ordered to remove the septic system completely within 30 days and restore the land to pre-construction condition. If they failed, they'd face daily fines. Rachel gave me one look afterward that basically said we'd won round 1. Outside the courthouse, Claire finally approached me under the awning while rain tapped against the gutters. She looked tired. Real tired. "Ethan, can we just talk?" "Sure. Mark feels like this escalated too fast." I almost laughed. "Claire, your septic field is in my meadow." "I know, but removal is going to cost a fortune." "Then it probably should have gone on your side." She folded her arms and stared at the rain. "You really won't consider an easement?" "No, not even if we paid above market." "No." She looked frustrated, but also embarrassed, and for a second I almost felt bad. Almost. Then she said, "You know this could ruin us financially." And I answered, "That should have mattered before you dug trenches on my land." 30 days came and went. Nothing happened. Not a truck. Not a contractor. Nothing. The trenches sat there untouched. the gravel baked in the sun, pipe exposed in places. And every morning I walked that meadow and got more irritated. Rachel filed contempt the first business day after the deadline. Hearing number 2 happened a week later. Judge Baines looked irritated before anyone even started speaking. Mark's lawyer tried buying more time, claimed engineering complications, claimed rocky soil on their side, made redesign expensive, claimed contractor scheduling delays. The judge let him finish, then said, "You had 30 days. Then he imposed $500 a day in fines and gave them 72 hours. If they still refused, I could hire my own contractor to remove the entire system and bill them directly. That got Mark moving fast. 2 mornings later, I woke up to the sound of diesel engines. I stepped out with coffee in hand and nearly smiled. 3 excavators, 2 gravel trucks, a septic engineering crew. Mark standing beside them looking like he hadn't slept in a week. The crew started digging immediately. Bucket teeth tearing through packed gravel. Pipe lifted out section by section. Trenches widened. Connections exposed. Dirt hauled off. It was loud all day and somehow deeply satisfying. There's a strange kind of peace in watching somebody undo the exact mess they insisted didn't exist. Mark crossed over around noon while I was leaning against my fence. His boots were muddy. Shirt wrinkled. He looked exhausted. "Happy?" he asked. I took a sip of coffee and looked past him at a worker loading perforated pipe into a trailer. "Not especially, but I'm getting there." He gave me a tired half laugh that wasn't really a laugh. "You know we relied on a surveyor. And this didn't have to become a war. Then why'd you ignore the first court order?" He looked away, didn't answer for a second, then said quietly, "Because I thought eventually you'd take the money." I nodded. "That was your mistake." He stood there another moment, jaw tight, then walked back toward the excavators. By sunset, the entire drain field was ripped out. Every line, every gravel bed, every connection. Fresh topsoil was hauled in and spread clean across the meadow. The scars were still visible, but healing. Rachel later estimated just the removal alone cost them nearly $30,000. The replacement system on their own rocky slope would be dramatically worse. Specialized engineering, new permits, reinforced drainage, bigger excavation. I heard numbers from town contractors, and every version sounded painful. 70,000, maybe more. And then came the legal bills, the fines, the redesign, the surveyor issue, the stress. The whole thing snowballed so hard it became local conversation. Rural Vermont runs on weather, tractors, and gossip, and by the end of summer, everybody knew what happened. At the feed store, at the hardware counter, farmers brought it up while loading hay. Somebody even joked the Whitakers spent 6 figures trying to move dirt in the wrong direction. Mark stopped waving after that. Claire barely came outside. The contractors kept showing up for months, rebuilding everything uphill on land they should have used in the first place. And every time I saw fresh equipment over there, I couldn't help thinking how different all of it could have been if they'd just respected one old stone wall the first time around. But the part nobody saw coming came later. Because once the septic system was gone and I figured the fight was finally over, Mark Whitaker made one last move that somehow turned the entire mess into something even bigger. By October, I honestly thought we were done. The meadow had been reseeded. The fresh topsoil had settled in nicely after a couple cold rains. I'd already met with the organic inspector and walked the eastern section with him, explaining what happened and showing documentation Rachel had organized in a binder thick enough to stop a truck tire. He appreciated how detailed everything was and told me the field would stay eligible as long as restoration held and there was no contamination. That felt like finally taking a full breath after months of holding one in my chest. I figured the Whitakers had learned a brutal lesson, paid dearly for it, and wanted nothing more to do with me. Then one Tuesday afternoon Rachel called and said, "You're not going to love this," which is never a sentence anybody enjoys hearing. I was in the orchard pruning branches when she told me Mark had filed a civil claim against me. I actually laughed because I assumed she was joking. "For what?" "Economic damages," she said flatly. "He claims you unreasonably refused a fair easement and caused avoidable financial harm." I remember standing there holding pruning shears and staring out across the trees like maybe I'd misheard English. "He's suing me because I wouldn't let him keep a septic field on my land." That's the argument. That's insane. Rachel paused. "Yes, it is, but we still answer it." The hearing was 6 weeks later. Small courtroom again. Same judge. Same polished wood benches. Mark looked thinner than before, tired in a way money doesn't really fix. Claire sat beside him with her arms crossed the whole time. Their attorney tried framing me as unreasonable, claimed I had alternatives, claimed the easement offer was generous, claimed forcing removal caused extraordinary losses that could have been avoided through cooperation. Rachel stood up and dismantled every piece of it one by one. Calm, precise. Then Judge Baines asked one question. Just one. He looked directly at Mark and said, "Did you install private infrastructure on land you did not own?" Mark hesitated and quietly said yes. The judge nodded. Then the owner had every legal right to refuse permanent access. He looked down at the paperwork for maybe 5 seconds, then dismissed the case right there. No long speech. No drama. Just over. Mark's face went red. Claire closed her eyes and leaned back like she already knew. We walked outside, and Rachel gave me one of her rare smiles. That, she said, was satisfying. I told her dinner was on me. Winter hit early that year. Snow came down heavy in December, and the eastern meadow disappeared under white drifts. The Whitakers contractors were still out there trying to finish the engineered septic redesign before the ground froze solid. Temporary heaters, equipment tarps, mud turning into ice. Every bit of it looked miserable. Folks around town kept talking. Some blamed the surveyor. Some blamed Mark. A few thought I should have taken the money and been done with it. I heard every version. Vermont communities are like that. Nobody keeps an opinion to themselves very long. But here's what people missed. It was never about squeezing them or proving some point. It was my land, my future, the field I'd spent years preparing. And once you start letting people cross obvious boundaries because they offer cash and smile hard enough, those boundaries stop meaning much. Spring came around, and my eastern meadow came back beautifully. Thick green growth. Drainage exactly the way it had been before. I planted the first test rows there that April. Lettuce, carrots, beets, early greens. Watching those rows come in felt better than I can explain. Like reclaiming something. Like putting the land back where it belonged. The Whitakers listed their property in late summer. Quietly at first, then with a realtor sign at the road. Nobody officially told me why, but nobody had to. Between the legal bills, redesign costs, delays, contractor overruns, and the original excavation disaster, town estimates had them deep into 6 figures. Maybe more. They sold before winter. Below what they'd paid. I saw the moving truck one cold afternoon, and Mark happened to catch me by the mailbox. We stood there awkward for a second. Then he said, "For what it's worth, I should have handled this differently." I looked at him and said, "Yeah, you should have." He nodded once. No anger left. Just tired acceptance. Then he got in his truck and drove off. New owners moved in the next spring. Local family. Good people. We get along just fine. Sometimes I walk that eastern stone wall early in the morning with coffee in my hand and still think about how ridiculous the whole thing was. One wrong decision. One ignored boundary. One assumption that money could solve everything. And it ended with excavators ripping up thousands of dollars in brand new septic lines while half the county watched. To this day, I still hear mixed opinions whenever the story comes up. Some people say I was too hard on them, that I should have taken the easement and saved everybody trouble. Others say boundaries are boundaries and they got exactly what they earned. Honestly, I know where I stand, but I'm curious what you think. If your neighbor built a septic system on your land and offered money after the fact, would you have taken the deal or made them dig up every last inch? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy real stories about land disputes, small town conflict, and the kind of justice that takes patience to win, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.